Hi, Daniel here. Just a quick one to say. During this video, just if you're watching on YouTube on video, we had a bit of a bandwidth issue, and the video cut out, and we did that so that we could have a decent conversation because we were struggling to have a conversation with the video on for Amy. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Just a quick one to say that Amy's book sort of covers fatigue in a wide range of issues. So some of it is relevant for people with ME and chronic illness. Some of it is aimed at people that are dealing with fatigue just generally in life, across a sort of a wide spectrum. So some parts of the book may not be relevant for yourself, and that's okay, just to sort of discard it. Some parts might be helpful. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there before we kind of get into the discussion about Amy and her book, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. Hello and welcome to Post-Exertional Mayonnaise podcast, a podcast about living with ME and chronic illness, creativity and making meaning. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Amy Arthur. Amy's an author, and I'll read from her blurb on her book. She's an award-winning writer and science journalist with bylines in outlets like Popular Science, BBC Science Focus and Live Science. And she lives with ME and has written a book about pacing. So it's called Pace Yourself, How to Have Energy in an Exhausting World. I read the book over Christmas, actually, so it was an interesting sort of experience, kind of like Christmassy stuff, and then sort of reading the book. But yeah, thanks for Amy sent me a copy of the book, which was really helpful. And I thought what I'd do is, before we start, is I got a message from one of our viewers, listeners, Kathy Brooks, just last week or the week before, actually, which was really interesting. And she said, "Hi Dan, hope you're having a good weekend. If you haven't heard of this newly published book, I thought I'd share with you. I listened on my library app and got so much from it that I ordered a physical copy, and I'm re-listening. The best book I've read on ME and pacing specifically. I think she'd be a great guest if you could get it. so we got her.
Oh my goodness. That's so lovely.
Do you want to tell us a bit about yourself and your ME journey, kind of like what life was like before ME, and then what it looks like now for you afterwards, maybe?
Hi everyone, it's so great to be on the podcast. I've listened for a while, and to be here is kind of incredible. My ME journey, to say what was life like before ME is really hard because I don't remember much of life before it. I got ME when I was 15. As a teenager, I had a lot of trouble with like chest infections, tonsillitis and water infections. So I was kind of a regular in my GP service. But one time I remember going, and instead of my regular GP, there was a locum. And when we got there and explained the situation, explained normally I'd just get a short course of antibiotics and be fine. She rightfully explained about antibiotic resistance and why sometimes it's better to kind of wait these things out and see if we do need to go to the stage of antibiotics. And so I came away without any medication, and I completely understand why. But unfortunately, I got worse quite quickly. It turned out I'd had an E. coli infection. I was rushed into hospital with severe dehydration. I spent about a week in the children's hospital recovering. And then when I came out, I think, most of us will have our own stories of how we felt and how something wasn't right. But I just remember being a totally different person than when I was before. I was someone who, I was on a football team. I ran cross country for my school. I did loads of sports, loads of activities. Like every day, I think we had something going on after school. But I just couldn't do any of that. I couldn't even make the classes, that I'd loved before. It sounds really stupid, but I loved school. Like it was just somewhere where, I saw my friends. I enjoyed learning. So for me to not want to, or not want to go, was more that I just literally couldn't go. Of course, some people read that as, you don't want to, just get on with it. You're just a teenager who's lazy. But we soon learned after, I think it was maybe 6 months of this, that there was something going on. And I think I didn't. It didn't take too long to get my ME diagnosis. I know some people wait a really, really long time, but I think I was quite lucky in that with the paediatric service, perhaps everything's a bit more expedited. So I think I was officially diagnosed when I was 16, and I'm 28, nearly 29 now. So I've lived with it for, 13 years pretty much. When I was first diagnosed, I was sort of moderate, I would say. I dropped a lot of classes. I still managed to get to school using a wheelchair, which my friends thankfully pushed me around in. So I managed to keep up a couple of my classes. I did manage to get some A levels, which I was really pleased with. And then after a few years out, I managed to get to university. And at that point, I was able to walk. I had a lot of like what's the term, like reasonable adjustments that really meant that I could do it. But I did a degree in creative writing with publishing, and came out of it, and then I was definitely very, very mild. I'd had a few flare-ups and one bad relapse while I was at uni, but I was so much better than I had been before. And I managed to work full-time when I came out of university, and I worked for a number of years before, during the first lockdown or the second lockdown, I had a really, really bad relapse. I my functioning went from, like I say, working full time to, I think we worked out I had about 90 minutes of energy activity time that I could do each day. And adjusting to that was just, I think I'd gotten to the stage where I'd almost taken it for granted, my energy. Even though I knew I had to be careful, and I was still pacing when I was working, and I still couldn't do what other people did after their full-time jobs. I was still limited, but I had taken for granted that I'd have this amount of energy, and then to suddenly go back to, or even be worse than I was when I was first diagnosed. That was really hard. I was thankful to have a good GP who could help, who could refer me to, things that might help. And that was 2021, and here we are, 2024. I'm still not back to where I was at all. But I mean, I managed to write a book and publish a book, which was a lifelong dream, and I did it very, very carefully. And now I still can only work for, I think my limit is maybe 4 hours total activity each day. But yeah, that it feels like it's been a very up and down journey.
Yeah. So what led you to write the book, and how, sort of who's the book for, in a sense, because it's kind of very a wide kind of like scope, isn't it, for generally about sort of pacing life management, as well as you refer to your ME within that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, so the book kind of came about. It was an idea I'd had before I'd had my biggest relapse. In the lockdowns, I think I was seeing so many people around me who were really, really struggling with coping with, a change, so much change to their normal routines, so much stress and worry and fear. And it was really, people around me has almost had their eyes opened to what, extreme fatigue and exhaustion could be like, even if temporarily. And so a lot of what I'd kind of learned over the years about my own energy levels, I would talk to people about it, and they'd say, "Oh, I didn't realize that," or "That's really helpful." And it seemed to me that there wasn't many people who really thought too much about their limited energy, whatever reason it was. Like, I have friends who, one has endometriosis, I've got one who's neurodivergent, and obviously all these things do have a toll on ourselves, and they affect how we feel day to day. But they'd never really thought about their energy as being something that could be influenced by external and internal factors, or something they should really be thinking about. So I guess the idea then was to write something. I mean, so I'm a science journalist, and I was reporting on COVID strains, on long COVID, and on other kind of health research that was coming out at the time. So I sort of knew that writing was really my strong suit, and I wanted to be able to write something that would help people. But then I wasn't too sure whether it would be a book or just articles or whatever. Then I had my really bad relapse, and I almost kind of had to go straight back to basics and experience pacing, all over again. And so when I came out of, well, not out of that, but when I was feeling a little bit better, this idea came back to me, and I said, you know what, I struggled so much at the beginning of my relapse to understand what to do, that I thought I needed to really pull together everything that we, science and research, knew about energy fatigue and how we can pace ourselves, not just for me but for other people who, when I was first diagnosed, I was given, I think, like a 1 or 2 page leaflet on pacing. It was, here you go, learn about your energy, pace yourself, and you'll be fine. And and again, when I had my relapse like a decade later, it was like the same leaflet, and I was thinking, we're really not, we're just told, it seems like it should be common sense, right? Just balance your activity with rest, don't do too much, you'll be fine. And it's so not that. But I know, doctors find it hard to even know what that looks like and to give the practical advice. And I guess that was what made me kind of think we need something to turn to. And this was a book that I would have needed when I was 15, and again when I had my relapse. Like I needed a Bible to really help me orient myself within this new landscape of limited energy.
Yeah.
And I was lucky from having worked as a journalist and knowing people within sort of publishing. Like the publishing industry is really almost really difficult to understand even when you're inside of it. So I'm very thankful that I had the opportunities that I did have to be able to get this book out, because it's almost like a hard sell. I mean, we know that like stuff to do with ME isn't, we see ourselves misrepresented in the media so often. I was really worried about whether people would want to publish something that was like a real person's experience of the condition. But no, I'm very thankful that we got to publish the book, and I've had really lovely messages from people with ME or people with long COVID, or I spoke to some people from a charity, people with heart disease, who fatigue is like one of the number one symptoms, but it's also the one that there's very little they're given. Like, if you have high blood pressure, they can give you tablets, but if you complain of fatigue, that you're just told, oh, just rest a bit more. So yeah, it's been really great to chat to people, not just from my own community, but from others as well.
It was interesting for me reading the book because it made me reflect quite a bit on. I think it's a sort of book that's helpful for kind of like people, like kind of almost living with fatigue with a number of conditions. For ME, you sort of like refer to sort of, you do little sections about ME, don't you? And it's sort of like a wide reaching book. And I think what it would have really helped me, like in the 6 months before I got ill as an adult with ME the second time, in the sense that like I was like pushing really hard at life. Like life was like really busy. Like we had 2 young children. My wife was studying. I was working full time. We were trying to juggle kids, like childcare, and like picking children up from school and all that sort of stuff. So like life was just like really busy. And I think for me reading the book, I was reflecting back on that time and thinking, oh, like I wish like how much did I push too hard? And I didn't think that ME would ever be like a part of my life again. So it was like, it was sort of like, oh, ME was in my past, and it was somehow there, like lying underneath the surface. And I think so often we don't step back and sort of think about sort of how we're balancing life. I know you do. You don't. You in the book. You're quite clear about you don't like the term work-life balance, and talk about pacing more. And I think that's really valid. But there is an element there that there's a you sort of refer to work quite a bit, and like thinking about careers and thinking about how these things all like fit together. With the pace of our life and how we pace our lives. So yeah, it's certainly interesting. Was there a challenge there in terms of like interweaving your own experiences with ME in the book and thinking about like the science of fatigue generally, and things that help fatigue generally versus the things that help with or may not help
Mm,
with ME, because sometimes there's things that like you do refer to like exercise sometimes.
mm,
So there's like a challenge there in some ways, isn't there, to sort of thinking about how somebody who doesn't experience post-exertional malaise might go about helping their fatigue levels, versus somebody that's got ME. Was that a kind of like a difficult
yeah.
balance to find?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think, right at the start, I had to kind of make or the publisher and I had to make a decision
Mm,
as to was this going to be like a book specifically for people with ME or long COVID, and very much tailored to advice around avoiding PEM and stuff like that, or was it going to be kind of a wider look at fatigue and energy levels that interweaved my experience with ME? And like you say, I try and have sections that say, this is what this type of energy means for ME or for post-exertional malaise.
mm,
Yeah, with exercise, it's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because there's lots of conditions where, or even just in general, people who don't have ME say that exercise helps alleviate
mm,
some fatigue, especially like mental fatigue and emotional fatigue. But that's definitely not the case for us. Like,
mm,
if, yeah, when you have a condition that has post exertional malaise, everything sort of changes, and you really have to find your own ways of avoiding PEM, but also limiting your activity and energy to avoid it. I think one of the main things I wanted to do with the book was really emphasize that we're all very kind of unique, and
mm,
it's a case of experimentation, I guess, in a safe way. The stuff that, so my day job as a journalist means that mental energy is really important to me, and I need to kind of prioritize it almost. However, the things, I could sit and perhaps read on my screen for an hour, and the toll that will take on my energy and the symptoms that would come from that will be very different from someone else who has a different experience of ME.
mm,
So I didn't really want to say this is exactly how it goes, and this is, and I didn't want to kind of make it seem like, oh well, my experience is this, so you will have the same outcomes if you follow my lead. Like, it wasn't meant to be a I found the solution and you all need to
mm,
copy, because I know it's just so, and a lot of it is that learning, isn't it, about your own body and how your own energy goes. And I'll still make mistakes now. Like, I'll overestimate the energy I've got, or I'll underestimate the
mm.
impact of a certain activity. It is, it's constant learning and adapting to new symptoms, new conditions, even the changes in the weather will impact my
Yeah,
energy levels.
yeah, yeah, yes. And some people find that they're kind of better in the summer, or
Mm,
um, for me, it just seems to kind of be a bit random. Like I'll go through phases where maybe I do have a better few weeks, and then I'm like really rough for like months on end, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of pattern to it. So
mm,
it's a difficult one, isn't it?
mm,
And I guess you writing about pacing, it's, and like you say, I think particularly for those of us with ME, there's like a huge spectrum in terms of people that are maybe on the milder end, which isn't mild, but it's like people that are just about getting by with work, and
mm,
then
mm,
people like myself and others that are kind of like moderate, but actually moderate is really rubbish because like we're actually kind of like I'm mostly housebound and unable to work, and kind of doing the podcast is kind of like almost the only thing that I can do apart from
mm,
surviving and cooking some meals and things like that, and trying to do housework and things. So it's, and then obviously the severe end where like it's very difficult to kind of like even think about pacing when you're living with severe ME. I mean, I've kind of been there myself, but it's what's interesting is kind of like I think you refer, I was just reading earlier, to sort of like trying to find small ways to have agency within your
mm,
life, and because that is like really important, having a sense of agency, isn't it, despite everything, and a sense of some sort of control over your life. Because when you're living with severe or very severe ME, and we've seen, like, you know, in the well, not in the news, but in ME social media circles recently, about, you know, 2 or 3 individuals that are in hospital, and the, you know, the lives are at risk and things like that. So there's this whole like wide spectrum, isn't there? And it's very difficult to kind of get that, to sort of get that balance. But I think what you're trying to emphasize in the book is trying to find that ability to get some sort of control over your life, whatever the kind of like level it is. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and with so much of this condition being so unpredictable, and you know, feeling like at any moment the energy I do have could be taken away again, and you know, there's so many things I have such little control over. For me, you know, I do have to keep reminding myself of how important agency is, and like, it's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because when I was worse, there was a lot to deal with, that grief. I know you've talked about on the podcast before, and coming to terms with what your life looks like now, and almost in the very first few days of my relapse, the one thing I could hold on to was literally just writing down the stuff I was doing. Like, it would be like, you know, oh, I managed to get up and go to the bathroom, and to see it written down, and to go, I did that, and that was something I, you know, had agency over, I guess. But again, there's so many people that don't have that ability anyway. So it's, agency and control is certainly a privilege. But I do try and say in the book that from what I've read and the research and from my own experience, this that having some small sense of agency wherever possible is, it at least gives something to hold on to in an otherwise completely unpredictable life experience.
One word that I learned about in your book, and that I hadn't, or I'm not aware of whether I'd heard the word before, was teleo anticipation.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that is, and kind of how maybe we can, in terms of thinking about ME and chronic illness, how we can sort of how we can incorporate that, or think about how that kind of like impacts us? Because I found that really interesting.
Yeah, when I heard about it first, I was like, wow, this adds up. It makes so much sense. It really helps me frame things. So teleo anticipation, I learned about it from a sports psychologist who I was interviewing right at the beginning of researching the book, because I was interested in you know, the what sports science research looks into fatigue, and how that differs for our day-to-day lives. But he really kind of offhand told me about this concept, in which really is only written about in sports science literature, where the brain, you know, say you're, I mean, I obviously can't do this, but say a person is running a marathon, their brain has to work out almost how they're going to pace themselves over the next, I think it's 26 miles. And it does, and that's what they call teleo anticipation. So teleos is like a goal or end point, and it's how their brain anticipates reaching this end point. And the brain will take into like account previous experience. So if they've run marathons before, if they've been training for it, it'll take into account how their body feels, what the terrain is like. Maybe it's a hot day, maybe it's a cold day. It does all this stuff kind of subconsciously to help the runner pace themselves. But what they say in sports science is that often the brain's teleo anticipation is largely incorrect, or it's something that we override quite a lot, because runners will know that they can push themselves further, or that they have to reserve a little bit in the tank to sprint at the end, or, you know, there's so many things that the brain can't take into account when it tries to think about how people should pace themselves. And I think for me, it kind of triggered something in my mind to go, oh, you know what? I do let my brain almost set the pace, or set my expectations for how something should go. And often it's the reason that I'll get stuck into, you know, I'll do an activity, and I'll just go along at this pace that either I've seen other people do, or I've assumed that, it's really going to be sound like maybe a strange analogy, but like I grew up watching my grandmother knit, and for me, crafting is one of those rest activities that when I have the energy to do it, it really helps me take my mind off things, and it is a good rest activity for me. But I'd find myself like trying to knit at the speed she did, and
Mm.
trying to go and do what she did, and make myself worse because I was putting all this pressure on myself, or trying to go too fast. And there's so many bits in my life where I've gone at a set pace and not ever stopped to think, why am I doing it like this? Why do I think it has to be done in X number of hours or at X speed, or even that I have to do this thing? Is it that my brain has subconsciously gone, this is the way things are done, therefore this is the way you should do them. And so I'm really trying hard to kind of get away from that helio anticipatory voice in my head of this is what you need to do, and actually stop before I do anything and go, okay, for me, how should I approach this? What do I need to do? What do I need to be careful of? What are the ways I can, what are the pitfalls that I can see if I try and tackle this in the way that my brain is telling me should be done? Am I actually going to make myself worse?
Mm.
And I kind of really liked the idea of like, this is just the brain is trying to do its job. It's trying to preempt things. It does it because it thinks it knows better, right? It thinks it's worked out how to do something. So it's no fault of mine that I've been going at this pace, and perhaps maybe sometimes going into PEM. It was just a sort of, okay, there is this thing, and I need to now take a step back and perhaps be a bit more mindful before I do things and before I rush into something just because that's what I think I should do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I was having a Twitter conversation recently about. I think somebody raised this issue of almost when you're living with ME and you do have a bit more energy, like it's almost like there's something neurological going on in our brains that sort of like stops us from remembering how horrible it is when we crash. And it's almost like, and I could so relate to it because I think when I can go for like weeks and weeks and weeks where I'm like doing very little and I'm spending most of my days in bed, and then I have like a slightly better couple of days and I'm like trying to do housework and I'm like, oh, I need to do this, and because you're almost like trying to make up for all the things
Yeah.
that you've not been able to do, and there's an element of like guilt for not being able to kind of do things, and like, and there's also like living with the sort of stigma of like laziness or whatever, like the labels that we've carried for years because of our illness, and almost like wanting to demonstrate that we're not lazy, so therefore we can like push ourselves too hard the other direction, and it's one of the hardest things I find is like trying to rest when you don't want to rest, and you've got and like sometimes for me it's almost like a little bit of like a nervous energy, like you when you do have that energy, and that's in your book, you sort of like talking about the importance of rest as well and how we manage that. Do you want to talk a little bit about rest and how sort of that featured in the book? And one of the things that it was almost like you were talking about for us needing to like give ourselves permission to rest, which was really interesting.
Yeah, I think rest is one of those things that like we will have our own relationship with, but I know certainly for me, for a long time, I really resented having to rest. I really, it's one of those things that people who don't have ME will just be like, oh, well, you just, have to rest more. And isn't that fun? I wish I could rest all day.
Yeah.
And there's so much around resting that people don't kind of appreciate. But also there's like, I think we assign this morality to, how we spend our energy, or what we do, like the laziness, like the telling ourselves that, if we do something that might be a waste of energy, like we're really careful about how we use our energy because we have to be. But when we start to think about good versus bad ways to use energy, we then fall into this trap of like making decisions of how we use our energy based on something that isn't, there is really no good or bad, moral way to use energy. There's the ethics around energy use are that you have your energy and it gets used. It's going to get used. Our body creates energy and uses it, and then has to rest and recuperate. So I think for me, it was unpicking this idea that to rest was to waste time, was to be unproductive or lazy, or that, when I would rest and my mind would be running over all the things I should be doing instead, or I want to be doing, or how much I dislike resting. And those things were using up my energy, and I wasn't really resting as such. Like, I was resting my body and avoiding using physical energy, but I was totally using mental and emotional energy, beating myself up or thinking about all these things I wanted to be doing. So finding that relationship with rest where I could, I still have those thoughts and those feelings, and I still sometimes really, really hate having to rest. But trying to develop a relationship with rest that was a bit more civil, I guess. We're never going to be best friends, me and rest, but I have to be able to do it and find a way to do it that works for me, I guess, as well, because there's so many different ways to rest. And like, for some people, I think it's Natasha Lippman as well, who talks about this idea of like switching activities so that, say you do, you use a lot of mental energy, and then after that you need mental rest. But for, that doesn't necessarily mean inactivity. It doesn't, for people who are, perhaps have, obviously if you're moderate to severe, like, rest means very little. But for people who are able to switch tasks to something that's, so mental rest for me would be something that engages my senses, which still often, that might be like running a hot bath. And obviously when you have a bath, there's physical energy implications. Like, it is not an energy neutral activity. However, I'm able to kind of allocate energy to it because I know that it will recuperate energy in another aspect. Does that make sense? So I think it was just for me thinking about rest in like these different ways to work out what I needed when. Yeah, and like, I think I say in the book that it's better to choose to rest than to be forced to rest, and that I have to, I almost need that like tattooed across my forehead or something, because there's so many times where I'm tempted to just do a bit more, or just push myself, or just say yes to something else, or just, do something that I really, really want to do. And it's almost like I need to remind myself, if I do that, I can choose to do that. I have that choice. However, if I do that, then I'm almost choosing enforced rest for the next however long. Or I can postpone that and maybe do it another time or later, or when I have my energy again, but without the same consequences. Like, I can choose to rest now. Obviously there's things that come up that we just don't, sometimes we just have to induce PEM because life makes us, right? And in those cases, it's even more important to then, you can't avoid doing what you're doing, but after that, you need to prioritize rest.
Yeah, I thought, because there's also a chapter about emotional energy output, and that made me really think, because so often when we talk about ME, we're thinking about sort of activity in terms of physical activity, doing things like for me, it would be like sweeping the floor or mopping the floor. That would really exhaust me, and that's, it's kind of like, it's not depressing. Well, it is depressing, but I don't like using that word, but it's sobering, I suppose, when you realise that like your level of ability is so low that it's gonna, anything that kind of that you do, and I think we can accept the mental energy output as well, like the fact that both of us will probably like be impacted by having this conversation, but it's a really valuable conversation to have, so I'm pleased that we're having it. But I think so often we sort of forget about the emotional output, energy output, and how that can impact us as well. But one thing that was really interesting that I think you you talked about was almost like needing a level of emotional positive energy output as well, like the balance in that kind of sometimes actually if we don't have a positive emotional experience, then that can impact us just as much. Do you want to sort of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it is kind of that finding that balance. And when we spend a lot of time with a lot of negative emotion or negative emotional activity, whether that's arguments with other people, whether it's negative self-talk, when a lot of our emotional energy gets spent in that way, it's almost like that becomes our baseline, for want of a better word. And so anything other than that can be even more exhausting. Whereas when we have a bit more balance between positive and negative experience, our baseline ends up a bit more in the middle. And so, I think, psychologists talk about this scale of emotional arousal, but when they say arousal, they basically mean energy. So you have like high energy emotions, which are things like anger or things like ecstasy and joy, really, really either positive or negative, but very extreme kind of ends of the spectrum. And then there's the like lower arousal emotions. Boredom is one of them, but also calm, relaxation. There's a few others, but when we spend so much time in either the high energy positive or high energy negative, we're kind of always draining our emotional energy, and we're not kind of giving ourselves those experiences of low emotional energy that actually are pleasant and regenerating. I find myself sometimes that my whole day is spent either high positive or high negative. And then I wonder at the end of the day, even though I've paced my mental and physical activity really well, I'm still completely exhausted. And I have symptoms of PEM because I've really taken it out of myself emotionally. So it was really interesting to kind of read about those sort of that spectrum of emotion. But yeah, so like I talk in the book a bit about too little and too much of the different types of energy, so emotional, mental, and physical. And yeah, it's funny, isn't it, that too little energy expenditure can actually make us feel a lot worse. It's like a bit of a paradox, really, isn't it? Like using more energy sometimes can make us feel less exhausted. Only, and this I'm not talking about like going and doing exercise or pushing yourself or anything like that. I just mean that like sometimes if we can sort of prioritize these experiences of positive emotion, we will find ourselves better able to cope with other experiences of emotion. So
Yeah.
just noticing like the emotions you have each day, and generally what are they tended towards negativity. And it's so hard because like how can you not be tended towards negativity when you live with this condition? But that kind of made me even realize it was even more important for myself to at least try to seek out, or try to, like, if when I was choosing rest activities, for example, like there's no point me choosing one that is going to exacerbate these negative emotions that I feel. Like if I really hate doing something, it's not going to be a suitable rest activity. I need to find something that can give me a small amount of positivity. And like another thing that really came through that I hadn't even thought about before I started writing was the impact of social media on our emotional energy, especially.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It was funny that like writing the book taught me a lot about my own experience that I never even thought of before.
Yeah. Yeah. The social media thing's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. But just going back to the the emotional energy output. It's funny because like one thing my mum often says to me is like, "Oh, Danielle, I can't believe you're not like depressed," and and it's and it's interesting because she says that and I think, well, yeah, it's funny because it's almost like I've kind of like learned to almost like contain those emotions, like in a way, like like I went through sort of therapy when I was sort of first ill for like a good 18 months, and it was really helpful and things. And I kind of got to the end, and I was like, I think I've learned to how to sort of like manage those emotions as much as possible. And like you say, you can't avoid things happening that kind of like actually, wipe you out or emotionally wipe you out or drain you, or things that crop up in life. But it's trying to kind of like it's trying to find that balance, isn't it? But yeah, this social media is an interesting one, because you refer to that in the book as well. And it's so hard for us, um when you're living with ME and chronic illness. Like it's like, for me and for so many others, like social media like is a lifeline in terms of like supporting that emotional energy in a way, because like all, like for me, most of my friendships and my connections are online. I very rarely see anybody other than sort of like my sort of family and things.
Yeah.
Especially living on a farm in the middle of nowhere. But so I see the postman or whatever, or just Amazon delivery drivers. I'm like, hello. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? But so social media it's almost like both, like something that's really valuable and really helpful, but it's also something that can be very draining as well. And yeah, how is that for you in terms of like sort of managing that, and managing um to try and find that balance when using social media?
Yeah, that's I like knowing how important it is to have social connection, and especially when you have like I really like I'm like you. I don't see really anyone other than family, and traveling where I live. I'm quite far away from friends and family, so I have to travel to see anybody, and that as
Mm,
a layer of energy use. So and it is very important for our overall like health and well-being, especially mental health, to have the social connection. Loneliness is such a beast, and it takes so much from us. So and especially with like finding other people in the ME community is I'm always so heartened to share an experience with someone, and it feels like you're not going through things alone. And there's so much valuable stuff in being part of these communities on social media. But there is that flip side of either the rest of social media or just what comes up.
mm,
And for me, I've really had to, like recently I've had to kind of like figure out where the scales fall. Like is the positivity outweighing the negativity? And I just found that like being on social media, I mean, it's one of those things like when you have when the book comes out, the publisher's like, right, you need to promote it, you need to be active on social media, you need to build your following. And it
mm,
became a thing where I was like, there was nothing positive that I was getting from my social media. I'd be scrolling through Instagram, saying I'd be seeing pictures of people out doing amazing things, or their holidays, or their work achievements. LinkedIn was full of people doing stuff, and I was there really struggling at one point.
mm,
And I just found that every time I picked up my phone, I was depleting emotional energy, and I wasn't gaining anything from it. The stuff that I'd been gaining from being part of those ME communities, then I felt guilty. I felt like I couldn't be part of these communities anymore, because then I'd be seen as like, I don't know, being there to promote the book, which it wasn't. It was like
mm.
these were communities I'd loved and appreciated before, but now I was worried about using them. And I just had to really think about what am I getting out of this. And is when I was sat down and maybe resting and going on my phone, which normally I would use videos especially as a rest activity, because I love to watch people do like pottery or gardening or all the things that I wish I could be doing.
Mm,
I do appreciate seeing that and feeling part of creativity, even if it was just through a screen. But it wasn't having the same impact anymore. It was just making me feel worse. And I've actually I've deleted all my social media apps from my phone. I think it was like
wow.
2 weeks ago. I just decided, you know what, I'm just gonna take them off and see what happens. And if I do really miss them, or if I feel worse, or I can always download them again. I just need to see and test it. And honestly, I feel so much better. It's
Really, it's interesting.
I have lost a few of those connections, and I have to now make more of an effort to perhaps text people, which I
Mm,
struggle with anyway. But I have I have reduced that kind of negative drain on my energy, and that's just
Mm,
something that I had to experiment with for myself. And I think that'll change again, and it'll keep changing. And for people who do find that they have this positive and negative relationship with social media, I think it's always worth every now and then reflecting and going, is this what is the weighing scales? Is this overly positive or overly negative?
mm.
And just having that check in every now and then is a good opportunity to just assess whether these things are helping or perhaps hindering.
Yeah, that's interesting because I sometimes think, oh, I think do I? I know, like for me, one thing that I used to be like quite like a current affairs junkie, so I'd always like be
Yeah.
keeping track on the news and like reading news articles and I sort of consciously took a step back from that um maybe a couple of years ago, and I sort of just check the news headlines a couple of times a day now, and I don't watch the news, I don't listen
Mm-hmm.
to the news, and I think that helped me a lot because you can get so sort of just frustrated and angry about what's going on in the world, can't you? And
Mm-hmm.
particularly things around disability and things. And it's finding that balance of wanting to engage and be like an activist on a level about disability issues, but at the same time like protecting yourself and not letting yourself get eaten up by it, because I recognized that I was just getting really angry about everything, and actually my anger wasn't going to change anything in reality. So yeah, but yeah, it's interesting what you're saying about social media and like making me think about like how much do I spend on time on there. I might not actually tweet or post much on social media, but I'm always scrolling and things like
Scrolling,
that, and
yeah.
that's certainly made me think. And yeah, like maybe I can understand why people do kind of take a step back, but it's also there's so many people within communities on Twitter and Facebook and things that are supportive and things like that. So it's a difficult balance, isn't it? It's and the negativity on particularly on Twitter and things like that is around the stuff that you see that you just don't want to see, that you don't agree
Yeah,
with, but like it's just there in
it's
your
just
face,
there, yeah.
and it's hard, isn't it? Yeah, so it's about sort of trying to find that balance, but
Yeah. And we do need, like you say, that anger. You know, we need people to get angry at stuff and to fight for stuff, and that's how stuff kind of gets done, isn't it? But also,
mm,
like, there's only that can't be all of it. Like, I just can't be angry 24/7. And I felt like there was always, like, when the Dragon's Den thing happened,
yeah,
I was seeing everybody's responses on Twitter was just, incredible to see other people so angry like I was. Um, but I had to be very mindful not to get so sucked in that it became all that I was thinking about for like the week afterwards.
mm,
Because that, like you say, that anger just it's helpful to a point, but if it consumes you, then it's not serving anyone, and you can't do the activism if you're completely drained by the anger in the first place. So it's so hard to find that balance.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. Yeah, one thing just before we finish is like um there was a term that you used in the book which I thought was really really helpful, and that and it sort of like really made me think about how I manage my own sort of energy levels and things. And that was like you talked about being unconsciously competent, and I love that, and I really like that sort of like way of putting it, in the sense that for me that when I was reading your book, it was interesting because I was like, I don't know how helpful it was for me in a sense, because like certain things made me think, but then other things it was like I think it was affirming in a sense that I thought, well, yeah, I do that, or I do that already,
Yeah.
and it's almost like for me when I became ill again a second time, it was almost like kind of getting back on a bike again and remembering how to ride a bike, and that was really interesting for me because I was like, so in a way, I like it was horrible becoming ill with ME, but I sort of already had the tools from my younger years in terms of like how to manage ME, which was really interesting because so many people that this book would be really helpful for was sort of like coming into the illness and not having those tools. So I realized that already that I sort of knew in a way on a basic level. I'm like you said, I'm not an expert at it, and I don't think I always do manage my energy levels well or effectively or efficiently, and I don't see a lot of improvement. I don't see, even though I do manage I think I'm quite good at managing my energy levels. I don't always see pacing as something for me that kind of like helps me move on with my illness, but it's more about management. But I liked the way that you used unconsciously competent, and I thought it was quite. Do you want to say a little bit about before we finish, a little bit what you meant by that, and how that sort of like is something that you lean on?
Yeah, totally. So I think I can't remember where I first read about this kind of journey from going from being unconsciously incompetent to being consciously incompetent to being consciously competent to being unconsciously competent.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's a bit difficult to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right that I think the book was really aimed at people who are right at the beginning, who are perhaps incompetent, for lack of a better word, at
Yeah.
managing energy. Whether that's unconsciously because maybe you haven't got a diagnosis yet, or you're not sure why you're feeling the way you are. Then comes this consciousness of, okay, something's going on. Maybe I've got ME, I've got long COVID. I'm not. My energy is completely out of my control right now. And then you start learning about management, and that's kind of what the book is, I guess, aimed at. Is that those beginning elements of what energy is, how it gets used, how it gets regenerated, and all the things that day to day end up impacting you. So then you get to this stage of being consciously competent, like you're employing, pacing, you're thinking about your energy, but it is very much almost you're having to use energy to manage energy, right? Like it takes effort to do these things and put these things in place, and to stop yourself from doing activity when you know that you're almost going to go too far. That's all kind of like this consciousness of competence. And then eventually, I think, or the aim, it was that we hope we'll get to this stage of these things being kind of unconscious, like almost we're spotting the signs that we might, if we keep going, we'll have PEM, and we're stopping before that point, and we get like I've had ME for 13 years, and I would hope that most of the time now I am unconsciously competent of this management. Management is my life, right?
Yeah.
And it's become something that I do in the same way that I, put my socks on before I put my shoes on. It's just, when my brain funk's really bad, I really have to think about putting my socks on first. But most of the time, it's just an unconscious preservation of energy, or a consideration of energy. And like you say, for people who read the book who are already at that stage of knowing pretty much how their body, mostly how their body uses energy, and that feeling of fatigue, it might just be that the book is, like you say, reaffirming that you do know what you're doing.
Yeah.
There's a few things to learn from it, but yeah, it is more about that beginning stage of hopefully getting people through to a point where they feel a little bit more able to manage their energy.
Well, yeah, no, thanks for joining us. It's been really good to talk, and so sorry about the technical issues, and obviously we lost video, but it helped because it meant that we could actually hear each other. So, so there we go. So yeah, I would say to people, if they feel like the book would be helpful to them, if it's something that you're interested in, I'll put links to where you can get hold of Amy's book. It's called Pace Yourself: How to Have Energy in an Exhausting World, and it's published by Bonnier Books. Is there somewhere that's best to get it from? Is it just sort of like Amazon, or is what helps you the most in terms of people purchasing it?
Oh, lovely. Well, I'm not sure in terms of what helps me the most, but I think generally supporting in independent bookstores is good. But I would like to just kind of say, check it out from your library. Like, it's on most of the library apps. You can always email your library and ask that they'll get it for you, because I think there is that, if you're a listener of this podcast, you're probably already really involved in your own ME and also what the science says and all that sort of stuff. And it may be, I wouldn't want someone to kind of go and spend hard-earned money on the book and then feel like, oh, actually, this is just telling me what I already know.
Mm.
So do check it out from the library and get a feel for it first, or listen to the sample of the audiobook, just to see. And it might be something that actually is more useful for friends and family, because like
Yeah.
it's funny because my mum started reading it, and you would think that my mum perhaps already knows a lot of what my experience is like,
Mm.
but I don't know that she ever really, did understand what day-to-day living was like for me. So that's been really interesting as well. But
Mm.
yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really great to chat and to finally find a time where we're both feeling like we've got the
Yes.
spoons to do it.
we got there in the end. So yeah, yeah. Thanks for joining us, and yeah, I'll put links, and yeah, it's been good to talk. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
Cheers.